Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Take Your Shot podcast. Of course, as always, I'm your wonderful host, Joshua Gitman, and we had an incredible weekend of NBA basketball. We had a game seven ultimately. It looked like for a little bit late in that game six that we weren't going to have a game seven with the Cavs and Magic, but ultimately it panned out and the Cavs won in seven. So we'll recap that game a little bit. We'll get into why the Mavericks defeated the Clippers in 6 games. We'll also talk about the upset that happened this weekend in our first conference semifinal matchup. We'll go over the lights out segments with the Orlando Magic and the Clippers now being officially eliminated from championship contention. We'll preview the other conference semifinal matchups that we haven't previewed yet, and we will talk about the firing of Los Angeles Lakers head coach Darvin Ham after only 2 seasons at the helm of that position. So without further ado, we've got a huge episode for you today. So let's get right into it. And let's start with the Cavaliers as they complete the comeback in game seven and they win 106-94 in what was an incredible game, probably the best game in the series behind the game six. Game six was pretty awesome too. I'd say they're pretty even, but game six, Cleveland looked like they were going to win for a little bit. Then Orlando came back to ultimately force the game seven, but Cleveland in this game was down 18. It looked like that the Magic had fully taken control of the game. Everybody was silent in the arena. Looked like Cleveland was down, and then all of a sudden they made a run and they won this game and they won the series, and now they will move on to play the Boston Celtics. And this was Cleveland's first series win without LeBron since 1993. So it's been basically LeBron for the last 30 years of this Cleveland Cavaliers organization, carrying them into victories and ultimately a championship in 2016. They finally got over the hump of winning a playoff series without LeBron James. It was against a team that we thought was young and inexperienced, but you still got to give Cleveland credit for coming back from 18 points because in a game seven, that is particularly difficult to do, especially when it looked like everybody was pretty much out of it. And then a run was sparked by Cleveland. And then they ultimately, as I said, won the game. And then once again in this game, Jared Allen for the Cleveland Cavaliers was out for the third straight game in the series. I'll talk a little bit more about his future in the playoffs in a little bit, but he was out once again. And it's just a brutal loss for Cleveland because in the first 3 games, 3 to 4 games, he has been your second best scoring option. He was ultimately that guy who could not only defend, but also help Donovan Mitchell out a little bit. And that was the question we had going into game seven in a 1-game situation. Will the Robins, will the Alfords, who will step up for Cleveland to help Donovan Mitchell? That is always been the question with this Cavaliers team, and that will be a question going forward. But in this game, he did get help, Donovan Mitchell, and that's ultimately why they won. In the second period, when Orlando was up 18, Karis LeVert helped Donovan Mitchell in a huge way, scoring, I think, 11 points in that quarter. And then in the third quarter, to cut the lead and ultimately take the lead after they trailed by 18. I think they were down by like 10 at that point in the third quarter. Max Strus got it going a little bit, scoring 11 points of his own, helping Donovan Mitchell out. Donovan Mitchell was, of course, amazing. But if you're Cleveland and you have to win games, you're going to have to rely on these other guys like Karis LeVert and like Max Strus. Evan Mobley to have a good offensive game. Georges Niang, Marcus Morris Sr. Those guys have to have good offensive efficient games, and at least 1 or 2 of them are going to have to help Donovan Mitchell, especially with Jared Allen currently out, not knowing when he will return for this Cavaliers team. And ultimately, that is why the Cleveland Cavaliers won this game, because they looked stagnant on offense. None of those shots were hitting in the first half. I think they started off 0 for 9 from the three-point line. It was a disaster from there. And then I think Dylan Windler, if I'm not mistaken, he also was a big contribution in this game for the Cleveland Cavaliers as well. He started hitting a couple of threes, get them going a little bit late in the first quarter to prevent a blowout. So the fact that Cleveland got those role guys going in a way that we really haven't seen it last playoffs when they lost to the New York Knicks, and we haven't really seen it consistently this season. It was a major, major contribution once again to why they won. Now going to Orlando's side of things. Orlando, of course, got off to the hot start. They looked like they were not missing from the three-point line. I think they started 6 for 9 from the three, and it was 6 of 11 from the three, and it was an incredible fast-paced start for Orlando, and they were hitting shots, they were getting stops like they always do, and they were up 18, and it looked like Orlando was going to get the first game on the road against this Cleveland Cavaliers team. But ultimately, what cost them, of course, has been their issue all season long, which is scoring the ball. As I mentioned, they started 6 of 11 from the field from the three-point line, and then after that, for the rest of the game, they were 3 of 18. That is 1 for 6, which is not good shooting percentages there. When you're 1 for 6, that is 16.7% from the three-point line to finish off the game. That's just not going to cut it if you're Orlando, and that has been their problem all season long. When a team who has a big lead, who is not that great on the offensive side of the ball, if you're the other team, just keep pushing and keep pushing, because that team that's not that great on offense, who has the lead, like this Orlando Magic team, has the opportunity and has shown all season long that they can potentially go on cold stretches. And when teams go on cold stretches, they start missing shots, the other team creeps back in, and they consistently could not hit a shot in the third quarter, late in the second quarter, and especially at the end of the game, they could not hit a three-pointer when it ultimately mattered. I think when it was a tie game, if I'm not mistaken, the Magic got 4 cracks at it to hit a three-point shot, and I think they missed all 4, and they got offensive rebounds, kick out for 3. They missed all 4. And then Cleveland got the ball, got fouled, and then hit an AM1, if I'm not mistaken. That was just one singular possession there. So Orlando offensive efficiency has really been what has cost them all season, and it ultimately cost them in this game. Once again, they've had a great season, and you've got to give Orlando a lot of credit for what they did this season, but ultimately that issue still lingers, and we will get a little bit more into that in our Lights Out segment with the Orlando Magic. But also a reason why Cleveland did come back was because of the efficient defense of Isaac Okoro. Isaac Okoro came into the second half holding Paolo Banchero to 3 for 9 shooting in the second half. It was when he was the primary defender. He was a huge reason why the Orlando Magic sort of collapsed on the offense, because the offense normally revolves around Paolo Banchero, and Paolo Banchero's not hitting shots, getting heavily guarded. The offense, which doesn't really flow normally, just continues to be an absolute disaster for Orlando. And Paolo Banchero was single-handedly in the first half, I would call it, carrying this team, as he scored 24 points in the first half for the Orlando Magic, and it looked like he was on a roll. But in the second half, Cleveland made the adjustment of putting Isaac Okoro on him, and Isaac Okoro did a great job on Paolo Banchero, and he really limited him, which was great as well. And then Evan Mobley. Let me talk about him for a minute. Evan Mobley's impact on the defensive side of the ball has been outstanding, and something that not a lot of people have been noticing in this series. Every time Orlando goes to the basket, it might not be an Evan Mobley block every time. It might not be an Evan Mobley jump ball every time. It might not be people backing out from the paint every time. But when Evan Mobley is contesting those shots on the inside, it definitely gives a scare to the player on the offensive side of the ball. It's definitely an intimidating factor for Evan Mobley to be there. And Evan Mobley has derailed shots, impacted shots just by his presence in the paint. And he has continued to stay out of foul trouble a little bit, even though he got into a little bit in this game. He stayed out of it in the second half for the most part when it actually mattered. And he has been out of foul trouble in the series, and especially when Jared Allen has been out, the huge defensive aspect for Cleveland, why they continually have won Game 5 in a close one. Remember, at the end of the game in Game 5, Evan Mobley had that huge block. Game 7, the Magic had to rely on their three-point shot basically the whole game because Evan Mobley was such a presence on the rim. And it worked in the first half, as we saw, but in the second half, ultimately, the terrible offense became the terrible offense once again. And it's because of Evan Mobley's impact on the rim. He's normally stretching out as a defender when Jared Allen plays, but the fact that Evan Mobley could adjust, become now the primary center, become now the primary interior defender, which is something that he has not done all season long, as I just mentioned, with Jared Allen on the floor, has been an absolute beauty to see, and it's been impactful for Cleveland. And it'll be interesting going down to this next series against Boston. Will they continue to do that if Jared Allen comes back, or will they put Mobley on the perimeter? Because Mobley has looked like just as good as a defender of Allen at the rim. And quite frankly, you can make the case that he's been better than Jared Allen at the rim for this Cleveland Cavaliers team. So we'll see what that adjustment for JB Bickerstaff is going into the next series. But this was a great Game 7. It was a comeback, and you've got to give props to Orlando for their season. Cleveland, a little bit scary at times, but they ultimately found a way to come back at home, and we'll move on. But let's continue with this show and go on to the Dallas Mavericks, as the Dallas Mavericks defeated the Los Angeles Clippers in Game 6, 114-101, as they will move on to the second round to face the number 1 seed, the Oklahoma City Thunder. And in this Game 6, it was just once again an incredible defensive effort by the Dallas Mavericks. The defense for the Dallas Mavericks, if I can get into a little bit of that, they have just been harassing, stopping on both the perimeter, the interior, and it is something that we have not seen in this Dallas team with Luka Doncic ever since he's been drafted in 2018. The concern for the Dallas Mavericks has always been the defensive side of the ball. Can they play defense? Luka's not a great defender. They don't really have those kind of interior guys to play defense. And the years prior, it's been for how good they can score, their defense has just been worse than their offense. Their defense has just been so bad that it's like that they allow more points than they're actually scoring. And it's incredible because Dallas has always scored at a high rate, but their defense was just that bad that it let other teams back into games. It let other teams win games. And ultimately, that's why they failed, because every single game with Dallas, you're like, oh, bet the over, because every single time you know it was going to be an offensive slug or not, because of Dallas's incredible offense with Luka Doncic and a little bit of Kyrie. They were in and out of the lineup last year. And ultimately their terrible defense. But this season, the 3 moves that Dallas made, the acquisition of Derek Lively at the draft, that was an incredible pickup for the Dallas Mavericks. They knew they needed to get bigger. They knew they needed to be more physical on the defensive side of the ball. And they got Derek Lively, and he was huge for most of the season. And he really didn't have, I would call it, a rough patch or rough stretch for this season for the Dallas Mavericks. He was pretty consistent and pretty solid all season long. He did have to take that leave of absence because his mom unfortunately passed away. But other than that, which is unfortunate for him, but other than that, it has been consistent production from Derek Lively this season. Then the 2 moves that were made at the trade deadline for Dallas, getting Daniel Gafford, somebody who is an underrated defender, somebody who we didn't really get to see this first half of the season really a lot, because no offense to the Washington Wizards, but who is picking up the phone, picking up the TV remote, and watching the Washington Wizards play basketball on League Pass? I don't think a lot of people are doing that. So nobody has really noticed Daniel Gafford's impact on the defensive side of the ball for Washington. And for how bad Washington's defense has been, they've been killed in the first half of the season. They were killed from the perimeter, not the interior. Gafford wasn't the problem for that defense. It was the Washington Wizards. The Mavericks saw that in Daniel Gafford, which most of the fans, most of the press didn't really expect, because Daniel Gafford has just not been noticed in Washington, and he has made an incredible defensive impact. And now it's not only when Derek Lively is out. When Derek Lively's out now, it's now Daniel Gafford making that defensive impact. And of course, they switch roles and he's starting now, and you can say the same thing. But in the first half of the season, when Derek Lively was out, they didn't really have a great backup big to play out there. There wasn't really that impactful big man that could go out there and do what Derek Lively was doing for this Mavericks team. But when they got Gafford, they could say, now they have 2 big men, 48 minutes, I can play consistent defense on the interior, because every single time you got past the guards, because we know that Luka's not necessarily the best defender, it was pretty easy to score on the interior. But now with those 2 presences on the inside, it's very hard to score, because Lively and Gafford are great block. They both can block the ball pretty solid. They both limit second chance opportunities at the rim, and they've both been absolutely incredible and have thrived in their roles. And they both are playing similar roles, and they both have excelled for this Dallas Mavericks team. And then the other acquisition for the Mavericks at the trade deadline, PJ Washington, someone at Charlotte who really was more known for scoring rather than defense, because of course, when you're Charlotte, you don't really have a lot of scoring options, and you're on the defense, and he hasn't really necessarily stood out on the defensive side of the ball in Charlotte, just like Gafford did in Washington. But when PJ Washington came to Dallas, he's guarding the best player. PJ Washington is the guy to guard the LeBron Jameses of the world. He's the guy to guard the Paul Georges of the world. He's the guy that's going to ultimately have a shot at guarding the Shai Gilgeous-Alexanders of the world. He has that opportunity, and he has been thriving at that opportunity because just like Dallas has done to teams this year, in prior years, Dallas has always let star players particularly thrive in there whenever they play Dallas. Star players have had a tendency to play good against Dallas, and it makes sense because Dallas, as we know, it's not a great defensive team. But when PJ Washington came on, that stopped. The problem was stopped because PJ Washington has pretty much been that impactful guy. He can run around with anybody. He can guard anybody. It can be a guard. It can be a big man. He has been somebody who has really ultimately been the best player stopper for this Dallas Mavericks team. And when you stop the best player, it limits offensive options because the best player opens up offenses for other teams. And that's what PJ Washington has prevented for this Dallas Mavericks team. And he has been thriving at that. So Dallas's defense has ultimately taken them to this win against a star power Los Angeles Clippers team. And now can potentially take them even further, advancing to the Western Conference Finals. But we'll get into that series preview in a little bit. But in this particular game, and in this particular series, Luka finally got the best of the Los Angeles Clippers, as in his first two playoff series in the bubble, they lost in 6, and in 2021, in that crazy series where all the teams won on the road except for Game 7, when the Clippers went at home, Luka Doncic lost in that series as well, and he has had trouble with the Clippers in the past, and he ultimately got past them in this series for the first time. And it was interesting going to the Clippers side of things for a little bit, the Clippers adjustments, because they decided to start PJ Tucker in this game, and PJ Tucker has been someone who has been known to have that defensive kind of dog impact that the Clippers have really been looking for in this playoffs, but they didn't really play him ever since they acquired him in the James Harden trade. PJ Tucker has mostly been a bench warmer, and we've heard about the complaints at the trade deadline. PJ Tucker wanting to be traded, but ultimately teams didn't really want to acquire PJ Tucker because he has multiple years on his contract, and he's sitting there at 38, not playing with the Clippers, a contender. So how do you expect him to play for other teams? So nobody really wanted PJ Tucker. So PJ Tucker was sitting on the bench all season long. And then the Clippers were like, in this game, PJ Tucker, you're starting. PJ Tucker, you're playing. And he actually made an impact. He actually was pretty solid for this Clippers team for a little bit. He hit his corner three, at his corner three celebration. He was playing decent defense on Doncic for the first half. And the Clippers were very competitive in that first half. And if I'm not mistaken, the game was tied at halftime. Yes, the game was tied at halftime, and it looked like the Clippers had a potential chance to send this to Game 7 back in Los Angeles. But in the second half, Dallas just did what they did best and had offensive takeovers. They started the third on an 11-2 run, and they finished the third on a 13-5 run. And ultimately, that is what did it for the Los Angeles Clippers, and that was the last bullet for them. And they officially are eliminated, and they lost that game by, I think, 13, but they were down 20 for most of the fourth quarter. Then I think in garbage time, they made a little bit of pushback. But ultimately, most of the second half was a blowout, and the Clippers are going home. And then going back to Dallas, the MVP for the series for the Dallas Mavericks on the offensive side of the ball, talking about a little bit of their strength rather than their defense. There, for the offensive side of the ball, it was Kyrie Irving this series. It wasn't necessarily Luka Doncic. Luka Doncic really took a little bit, I wouldn't say a step back, but he took a little bit of his primary role in being the best player and giving it a little bit to Kyrie Irving, giving him more opportunities to score, more opportunities to take shots. And it was a little bit of an odd comment, considering that Luka is one of the best offensive players in the world, if not the best in the world. And he decided to give Kyrie more opportunities. And Kyrie Irving thrived in this series because when you've got the best defender like a Paul George or like a Terrence Mann on a Luka Doncic, you're not putting your primary defender on Kyrie Irving. So Luka's like, hey, I know this defender's great. Kyrie has a weaker opponent guarding him. Kyrie can have more opportunities to score because he can score the ball just as good as me probably, and it worked to perfection. And Kyrie averaged 27 points in this series on 50% shooting. He was consistent every single game, and especially in that game 5, which was where they won by 30, was huge for them. In the game 2, and even in the losses of game 1, game 4 was huge for them as well. I think 40 in the loss in game 4. I don't remember the point total for game 1, but Kyrie has been a consistent best player for the Mavericks in this series, and part of that is because Luka said, "Hey, I want you to take more shots. I want you to be the primary guy here." But also, Luka Doncic had a little bit of the flu symptoms in Game 5. He wasn't really 100% there. He looked a little bit better in Game 6, but wasn't where we know Luka Doncic can be. But that should be better as we get into tomorrow, where they play the OKC Thunder in game 1. I expect that to be better as time progresses. And we'll see how the Mavericks play going into next series. Will they be relying on Kyrie Irving a little more than Luka Doncic like they did last series, or will Luka start to take a little bit more control on the offensive side of the ball? That's an interesting thing to see. But ultimately, Dallas on their defense and Kyrie Irving taking a step up in the series ultimately got them this series win and are moving them on to the second round, as I said, to play the Oklahoma City Thunder. But let's go on to our first conference semifinals matchup, where the Minnesota Timberwolves, upset Central, defeated the Denver Nuggets on the road 106-99, and they have stolen home court in game 1. If you ever thought at the beginning of the season that the Minnesota Timberwolves were going to be in the second round on the road in Denver and be in the opportunity to steal home court, which they did, I would have called you know what, crazy, because this Minnesota Timberwolves team had no expectations of getting past the first round, and it looked like a disaster last season with Gobert, and we thought it was going to continue, but this Minnesota team has proved the entire league wrong, holding on to the 1 seed for most of the year, dropping to the 3 ultimately at the end. But Minnesota now is in a position where they have home court advantage, and they have Denver a little bit on the ropes for game 2. Now it's a must win for Denver in game 2, because if you lose both on your home court, it's a tough series to come back from. It is definitely a tough series to come back from. So Minnesota right now has Denver on the ropes going into game 2, and Minnesota has the potential to not only win this series, but win the championship. The question is, am I buying the Timberwolves stock? I am absolutely buying the Timberwolves stock. This team is 5-0 in the postseason. They've looked flawless every single game they've played. And if they continue to play the way they have been playing, they will and probably will beat this Denver team. And I'll go a little bit into that in a little bit in just a second here. But ultimately, what has been the key for this Minnesota Timberwolves team? What has been the X factor for this Minnesota Timberwolves team, and who has been the star and most dominant player for this Timberwolves team all season long? Anthony, you know what, Edwards. 17 of 29 shooting, 43 points, as he joins Kobe Bryant as the only two ever, him and Kobe Bryant, that's it, the only two ever to score 40 points in consecutive playoff games when they were under 22. Under 22, 40 points in consecutive playoff games. Kobe Bryant, Anthony Edwards. That's it. Anthony Edwards is doing something that we have not seen for a very, very long time. And he reminds me, I wouldn't say of a Kobe Bryant. I would say Anthony Edwards reminds me of the young Dwayne Wade. Anthony Edwards plays exactly like Dwayne Wade. He is quick. He draws fouls. He can hit jump shots. He's explosive. He's a great defender. And he could lead his team to a title in his third season in the league. His third season in the league. Wait, 21. Actually, third. I think Dwayne Wade was the fourth. Anthony Edwards. Oh, yeah, they're both fourth. Fourth season in the league. Doesn't matter. That is, no matter what, it's still something that could potentially happen this year. And he is on the path right now to do that. And that has never been done before. Being the finals MVP that young, leading his team that young as the best player. That is something that has not been done in a very long time. And Anthony Edwards, so far, the way he has looked this series, the way he has looked throughout this postseason, the way he has looked through this regular season, it is definitely possible. The Minnesota Timberwolves could win an NBA championship this year. I've seen enough. I'm not saying they're going to win this series. I still think this will be a competitive 7-game series. Now I think I'm still going to roll with Denver in 7, but ultimately if Minnesota gets past this series against this Denver team, the way they've been playing so far, the Minnesota Timberwolves will definitely be in contention to win a championship. They will definitely have a shot to win the title and have a shot to upset the Boston Celtics in the NBA Finals if that were the matchup, which I'm assuming if Minnesota gets there, that's who they will be facing, because obviously the East is Boston's to lose. Now, in this game, remember, in this game 1, going back to just this particular game, Chris Finch is not on the sideline for this Minnesota Timberwolves team. Excuse me, he's not standing up and coaching this team. He has not been the head coach in this game because, of course, he has his injury. He's on crutches. So he was sitting on the bench acting more like an assistant kind of a coach. And we know what Chris Finch has done all year. We know the impact Chris Finch has. And now he's sitting on the bench as like an assistant coach, while associate head coach Micah Nori has now taken over the sideline duties, yelling at the players, communicating through the sideline, being the sort of the head coach role, calling the timeouts and stuff, leading the huddles. And the fact that Minnesota won with not their leader, not their head coach. Micah Nori is a great guy. Micah Nori is a great assistant coach. But remember, Chris Finch has been a leader, been a dog for this team, somebody that's really led this team this season, someone that's really made the adjustments, talked to the guys, being that voice on the sideline to really lead this team to where they have been. And I love Micah Nori, but the fact that they won this game, made a statement like this with him rather than Chris Finch being a head coach, unfriggin' believable. This Minnesota Timberwolves team continues to make surprises. And in this game, Minnesota actually started off the game pretty incredible. They got up 18-4, and then it looked like, here comes Denver. 44-40 at halftime. Denver leads after being down 14 in like the first 3 minutes of the game. And in the second half, it was back and forth. Most of the second half, it looked like to be a great and classic finish. Then all of a sudden, Naz Reid, the sixth man of the year for this Minnesota Timberwolves team, Naz Reid came into the game in the fourth quarter. He scored 14 of his 16 points in the fourth quarter. He hit 10 straight points at one point to give the Minnesota Timberwolves some breathing room from Denver. Ultimately, it was a tie game, back and forth. Then Naz Reid got on a absolute tear, hitting 10 straight points, and it gave Minnesota a 6-point lead, which in that particular game, when it was back and forth, that's a decent cushion in that game. And that's ultimately Minnesota didn't look back. Anthony Edwards hit some big shots, of course. Rudy Gobert got a tip in or two. It was flawless from there, and Naz Reid really started that run ultimately at the end of the fourth quarter to give Minnesota that win. And in this game for Denver, Nikola Jokic played great. He had 32, 9, 8, and 3 steals. But he did not shoot the ball well. And remember what I said prior to the series. If you're Minnesota, let Jokic score. Let Jokic be that guy. Make Jokic have a perfect game to beat you. Just stop the others. Stop Jamal Murray. Stop KCP from getting hot. Stop Michael Porter from getting hot. Stop Gordon from the dunker spot. We will let Jokic beat us. Do not let the other guys get hot. And that is exactly what Minnesota did in this game. And even though Jokic had 32 points, 9 assists, 8 rebounds, incredible game from him, they let him be the guy to score. He's the one who took the most shots for Denver. He took 25 shots, and he missed 14 of those shots. Even though he scored that much, he missed 14 of those shots. And Jamal Murray, on the other hand, struggled. Jamal Murray had his worst playoff game so far, and I think he had his worst playoff game personally in years. I think he was scoreless in the first half, and he really didn't get it going. I think he only finished with 9 points in this game. That is what I was praising and articulating the Timberwolves to do. They need to stop Jamal Murray. They need to stop the three-point shooters from getting hot, because when Minnesota is such a great defensive team like that, if you can just stop the guys from getting hot. We trust your defense, half-court defense, but if somebody's hot for Denver, somebody's hot for Denver. But in a half-court situation, nobody's hot. You've got your 5 on. Let Jokic beat you, because even if Jokic does get past you a little bit, you have rim protectors. You have the guys to stop Aaron Gordon at the dunker spot. You have the guys to get the rebound when Jokic misses a shot to prevent second-chance opportunities. And you have the perimeter defenders in Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, to stop those perimeter guys in Murray and Michael Porter. So Minnesota executed what I said to perfection. I'm not the coach, but that's what I thought Minnesota should have done, and they did that to perfection. And if they continue to do that, where Jokic has these great games, but he misses all these shots, this is going to be Minnesota's series to lose. And so far, it looks exactly like that. It's only one game. I'm not going to overreact, but going to Denver's side a little bit of here, they keep on continuing to let teams get off their fast starts. They let the Lakers get off to fast starts, leading every game in the first half. And it's a little bit of a concern, especially when you're going into a series now where you're playing a much better opponent. No offense to the Lakers, but the Timberwolves have just been the flat out better team this season. You cannot let teams like Minnesota, like a Dallas Mavericks team you may face down the line, like an OKC team you may face down the line, to get to a fast start, because ultimately it's hard to come back against those teams. It's way harder to come back against those teams rather than the Los Angeles Lakers. And when you're putting yourselves in that big of a hole, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. So Denver's got to stop these slow starts, stop these teams really getting onto them quick and really tearing them down early, like 18-4 to start the game. That's hard. That's a big deficit enough. And we've seen you come back from that, but it's much harder to do against the Timberwolves team. And maybe if you didn't get off to that rough start, you probably would have won the game because you made the run in the second quarter. If you just stay even and then you make your push, that's fine. But you can't put in all your effort to get back into the game to ultimately running out of juice, running out of momentum in the fourth quarter where Minnesota just takes over, because a team like Minnesota will expose you for continuing to be like having rough starts. And then also for Denver, I said last series that the bench didn't really play in effect. Well, now the bench plays in effect because this Minnesota Timberwolves team looks pretty good, if not just as good or better than Denver has so far in this postseason, and the bench is definitely going to come into effect in the series. Christian Braun needs to step up. Reggie Jackson needs to step up. Denver's starting lineup needs to get help because, as I said, if Denver continues to limit the Jamal Murray's, Case Michael Porter Jr.'s of the world, these bench guys are going to have to step up. And Denver, the concern we had this season going in, they lost Bruce Brown to Indy. Now he's in Toronto. They lost Jeff Green to Houston. Can they replace those guys on the bench? And in this game, we really just didn't see what we wanted to see out of Denver, this bench production in this game. Of course, as I said, it doesn't matter against the Lakers. No offense to the Lakers, but it's just not really something that's necessary. But Peyton Watson, you cannot score 0 points. Christian Braun had a solid game, but he needs more production. Reggie Jackson, 5 points is not going to cut it, especially when Murray's having a bad game. Justin Holiday, 3 points, not going to really cut it there. This bench is going to have to be better for Denver, and Minnesota looks to be pretty even with Denver right now. So the deciding factor for this team will be the bench, and the bench is what ultimately will carry this Denver Nuggets team to the title, which is what they did last season. But enough of that game. Of course, that series will be absolutely competitive. I still think Denver will win in 7, but Minnesota, watch out. Watch out for the Timberwolves. But let's go on, as I said, to our Lights Out segment, and let's talk about first the team that lost to Dallas in 6, the Los Angeles Clippers, a team that had a very up-and-down season. Remember, they had a rough start to the season after they acquired James Harden. Then they went on that tear where they went 28-3 from like December to March, and then they started struggling again. And here we are now. They are a first-round exit. Kawhi was injured to end the season, as he always is. And here we are sitting in this position for the Los Angeles Clippers now, where James Harden is an unrestricted free agent. Paul George is a free agent, assuming he declines his player option. Russell Westbrook is a free agent, assuming he declines his player option. This could get very interesting for the Clippers and fast this offseason. And they're going to have to make some tough decisions, especially after extending Kawhi Leonard. Do you bring back a Russell Westbrook? If Paul George gets a lot of money from one team, like a team that has a lot of salary cap room, like an Orlando or Philadelphia, do you match that offer? Considering if you do, you will be in the second apron for years to come. And if that's the case, you lose your first-round pick every single year. This is going to be very, very interesting for the Clippers on their approach this offseason. Do they run this team back? Because this team has been injured year after year after year and after year. So something may have to be changed. And they already committed to Kawhi Leonard. They gave him the extension. If me personally, I probably would have committed to Paul George and not Kawhi Leonard, considering his injuries. But they committed to Kawhi Leonard. So now you're going to have to make a decision with Paul George. And then with Russell Westbrook, do you let him go? Ultimately, that's just more money on the books. I think they ultimately are probably going to have to let Westbrook walk. I just don't really see, unless he takes a team-friendly deal, that he will remain with the Los Angeles Clippers, unless, of course, the team-friendly deal or he takes his player option, which in that case, he will stay for another year. But also for the Clippers, they're unrestricted free agents. Mason Plumlee, Daniel Tice, PJ Tucker also has a player option, along with Paul George and Russell Westbrook. Musa Diabate, Brandon Boston Jr., and Xavier Moon are restricted free agents for this Los Angeles Clippers team. And the Clippers, it's going to be tough, as I just mentioned. You can't afford to lose Harden and George. You just can't. But again, bringing them back, you're going to be in the second apron for a long time. So we'll see what the Clippers do here. I'm assuming, if I had to guess who's more likely to re-sign, I would probably guess James Harden will most likely re-sign, because I don't really see James Harden getting a lot of money outside of the Clippers. I just don't really see his market getting that high from other teams. And there's just, quite frankly, he's a picky guy, and he really wants to choose his spots of where he wants to play. And I just don't see, he's not going back to Philadelphia. I don't see him going to Orlando, and I don't see him going to the other teams, the bad teams that have all that cap room. So ultimately, I think Harden will ultimately re-sign. But if you're Paul George and you got that money sitting on the table from Philadelphia or from Orlando, what do you do? What do you do? And that will be interesting. And for the Clippers, I think what they could do to get better, I think they need a floor spacer, someone to control the offense, someone to help stop the double teams of James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, and Paul George. I think they need a true point guard. I don't think Harden can be necessarily that point guard. I think they could use a guy like Marcus Smart, a facilitator, someone who's great on the defensive side of the ball. I think someone like that would be a perfect fit for this Los Angeles team. I think they also could use a backup center, somebody with more big man depth, because ultimately, even though Ivica Zubac played great, especially in the playoff series against Dallas, Mason Plumlee, Daniel Tice, not really that great. And you could probably see them walk maybe, and maybe you're going to have to bring somebody else in. Maybe they commit a lot of money to somebody, but I don't really see that. They'll probably get a minimum big man, but they probably got to hit on that backup big man, because that will be important for them, especially when Zubac is out, and he gets injured considerably, a decent amount as well. So it's going to be important for whoever that backup big is to be a hit for the Los Angeles Clippers. But I just don't really see how you're going to get this team that much better. You gave all your first round picks to OKC. You don't really have a lot of trade chips. I just don't see a way, unless the Clippers are healthy, to really be that much better. There's just not a lot of flexibility here for the Clippers. And the only thing I can see them doing is just re-signing their guys. And we'll see what happens there. And if Paul George doesn't re-sign, what will happen to the Clippers? Will they continue to run the roster with Kawhi, or will they trade him? Because we've seen players sign extensions and say, "Oh, I want to go out. I'm requesting a trade." We've seen that before with a multitude of players. So it'll be interesting to see the Clippers' future, and I think that Clippers' future relies on whether Paul George goes or stays. So it'll be interesting for the Los Angeles Clippers. Let's move on, though, to the Orlando Magic, who unfortunately lost in that classic 7-game series against the Cleveland Cavaliers. You've got to give them props. They had an incredible season, exceeded expectations, getting 47 wins and getting the 5th seed, winning the division as well. Very incredible accomplishment for the Orlando Magic, and they are an up-and-coming, young, rising team, and they have a lot to look forward to with Paolo Banchero and with Franz Wagner for many seasons to come. And for the Magic, unrestricted free agents include Goga Batase and Markelle Fultz. Team options are Joe Ingles and Mo Wagner. Restricted free agents include Chuma Okeke, Kavana Harris, Trevion Queen, and Admiral Schofield. And we know, as I just mentioned, the team exceeded expectations, right? Good job, Orlando. You did great. But we know what you need. We know what you need. We saw it in Game 7. I just mentioned it. Their offense has been a disaster all season, and they need somebody who can hit threes, somebody who is a major scoring option, and somebody to replace Gary Harris in the starting lineup, so a shooting guard. And they're number 22 in offensive efficiency and number 24 in three-point percentage. It's pretty clear what Orlando needs this offseason. There's really nothing else to say about that. There are many options out there for Orlando, and they have the cap room, of course, because they're a young roster. Their extension guys haven't kicked in yet, which they will this offseason, but they have opportunities to get a guy like Malik Monk, get a guy like Buddy Hield, Gary Trent Jr., or even a Klay Thompson. Hey, why not? To come on this team and to help the team score. And I could see this team ending up with two of those guys, and maybe could they get a run on Paul George? Could Paul George say, if Orlando gives them the money, if Orlando offers him a max contract, 4 years, why not? Paul George has a lot to look up to. It's not necessarily on the Magic timeline, but considering how weak the Eastern Conference is, if you just get one star player, that can change your entire team and your entire outlook in this Eastern Conference. Literally, 1 through 8 this year, if they get one more star player, it could just change your entire outlook and your entire season for next year. The Magic would be the second best team in the East if they got Paul George. Just me. Any team, any 2 through 8 would be the second team in the East, in my personal opinion, if they got another star player. That's how tightly competitive the East is. And if you're second in the East and you've got Boston in a 7-game series, hey, who knows what could happen? You could win the East. You could win the East. And we've seen it with other teams before. We've seen the Heat beat the Celtics in a 7-game series. We've seen other teams beat Boston in these 7-game series before. So ultimately, you're in this Eastern Conference. You get one more star player, you're going to be a contender. And I think Orlando should definitely take their shot at Paul George. He has been an efficient scorer for Orlando. He has injury problems, of course, but I don't think that will be much of an issue with Orlando. No offense to the Clippers. And I think if they get Paul George, get one of those shooting guards like a Malik Monk, you're telling me you're rolling with a lineup of Jalen Suggs. You've got Paul George, Paolo Banchero, Franz Wagner, and the Wendell Carter Jr. off the bench, Malik Monk, or like Buddy Hield or the Klay Thompson option. You've got to be kidding me. That team's the second best team in the East. So Orlando has a lot of opportunity to improve this offseason, and they should definitely take advantage of it. I don't care if it doesn't fit on their timeline. They should definitely go out there and get some big players in the free agency. And also for this Orlando Magic team, they need to do it now. They need to get these free agents now. This is the season for them to get better because the Franz Wagner, Jalen Suggs extension talks are going to start this offseason. And then the following offseason, 2025 offseason, Paolo Banchero's extension talks will begin. So the Magic are going to be deep in the payroll in a couple of years. So this is the opportunity right here, this offseason, to get better. And Orlando should take full advantage of that. And one more thing for Orlando, I think they need a backup center ultimately. Wendell Carter Jr., if they can retain him, he's coming back, but if they can get somebody else, maybe throw money at Isaiah Hartenstein, maybe throw money at just some other backup big to help this team when the Wendell Carter Jr. minutes are out, a defensive presence at the rim to help them defensively, I think that would help Orlando as well. So if Orlando can do the stuff I just said, Orlando can maybe throw out money for Paul George, get a scoring shooting guard, and get a backup big, they will be the second team in the East. And they have the opportunity to do that this season. So we'll see what happens there. Another interesting offseason for Orlando to see if they can get better. Great season for Orlando. The future's bright, and take advantage of it right now. But let's go on to our second round previews, where we will start with the number 5 seed Dallas Mavericks playing the 1 seed, the Oklahoma City Thunder. In this series, in this regular season series, the Oklahoma City Thunder beat the Mavs 3 out of 4 times in the regular season. The Thunder won 126-120 in Dallas on December 2nd. The Mavericks won 146-111 on February 10th in Dallas. The Thunder won 126-119 in OKC on March 14th. And on the last day of the regular season, which it didn't really matter because the Mavs guys were sitting out, the Thunder won 135-86 in OKC. Now, of course, this matchup for the Oklahoma City Thunder will be way more formidable than their first round matchup against the Zion Williamson-less New Orleans Pelicans. And of course, it will not be a cakewalk for this Oklahoma City Thunder team. And it'll be interesting to see, considering this is probably going to be their first true test this postseason. Is their inexperience going to shine light in the series, or are they going to continue and assert their dominance to the Western Conference Finals? Because I could see this series going either way. This series, very, very tight. I'll make my pick at the end, but this series is going to be a competitive and going to be a classic Western Conference semifinal matchup. Now, in this series, particularly, I wouldn't be surprised if this turns into an offensive slug or not, because we know how great both of the offensives have been, especially you've got SGA, Jalen Williams on the Thunder, you've got Kyrie, Luka Doncic on the Mavericks, but also don't be surprised if this series turns out to be a defensive juggernaut. We know, and I just discussed what Dallas did on the defensive side of the ball, and OKC in their series against the New Orleans Pelicans only allowed 93.5 points per 100 possessions against the New Orleans Pelicans. So both teams have shown capabilities and shown much improvements throughout the season on the defensive side of the ball. So this series could go either way. This series could be high offensive games and competitive defensive games. This series it's just unpredictable. You can't bet over unders in this series because they're just so unpredictable, considering how both teams have just been so efficient on both sides of the ball to finish the regular season and to start the first round of the playoffs. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the story in both series, SGA, Jalen Williams, Kyrie Irving, Luka Doncic. That's the main story in this series, and that's what everybody, the typical NBA fan, is looking at. Both of those duos have really carried the loads for both of their teams on the offensive side of the ball this season, and both duos have been incredible. Both duos have looked like all-star caliber players, and especially Luka and SGA are in the MVP conversation. They probably won't win it. It'll probably go to Jokic, but both are MVP candidates and both are high-level elite players who can single-handedly carry their team to playoff wins and playoff series wins. So we'll see which one of those duos will play ultimately better, who will outplay one another. Of course, we expect Luka Doncic and Kyrie to, but you never know. Shea and Jalen Williams are for real, man, especially Jalen Williams. People undervalue what Jalen Williams' impact on the OKC Thunder has been this year. He should have ultimately been in the conversation to be an all-star. He really wasn't, but he definitely could have made the case to be an all-star for this OKC Thunder team. Now, I'm assuming that in this series, Lu Dort will be the primary defender on Luka Doncic, and SGA will probably guard Kyrie Irving. And I think if this is the case, just like last series for the Dallas Mavericks, what I said earlier, I think you need to give the ball to Kyrie Irving, let him attack Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Lu Dort is an incredible defender. Obviously, we know how good Luka is on the offensive side of the ball, and he will still probably find his way to score against Lu Dort, of course. But if you're Kyrie Irving, you attack Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. You did what you did last series. You could get Shai in foul trouble. You could get Shai a little bit on his feet. Shai will be playing a tough matchup against Kyrie Irving potentially in this series. And if Kyrie can do what he does, they'll probably have to make an adjustment. And it's tough to make adjustments, and you could potentially get Shai in foul trouble. So if Kyrie can continue to assert himself on the offensive side of the ball, which Luka has been emphasizing, Luka wants that, I think the Mavericks will have an opportunity to really assert their dominance on the offensive side of the ball and cause a little bit of problems for OKC going into games and finishing off games. Now, for the OKC Thunder, I think what they need to do in this series is assert Chet Holmgren on the defensive side of the ball. Chet has been huge for them all season long, of course. And you've got Luka and Kyrie who can, even though I should have just mentioned, two great defenders guarding those two guys, of course. But if they beat those guys on the offensive side of the ball, Chet Holmgren is one of the best rim protectors. When Kyrie Irving takes that mid-range jump shot, when Luka Doncic takes his mid-range fadeaway, can Chet Holmgren be there to contest the shots? And most importantly, can Chet Holmgren get rebounds and limit the Dallas Mavericks on this with their second chance opportunities? Because when Dallas gets second chance opportunities, they score on every single possession. It's basically automatic every single time. So if Chet Holmgren can limit the offensive rebounds by Dallas, and it's going to be tough because Gafford's a great offensive rebound. We know PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr. are physical in there. Of course, we would have said Maxi Kleber as well, but Maxi Kleber ultimately injured himself and will be out definitely for the series, if not the rest of the postseason. But if Chet plays great, and he probably will have to play better defense than he did even in the regular season. If Chet Holmgren plays great, the Mavericks will be on the ropes, and the Thunder can cause problems for those two guys, especially if he contests some shots just by being a presence, gets some rebounds, saves a couple of easy ones. That will be huge. It may be little things, one possession at a time, but Chet will be the key for the Thunder in this series. It's a tough series to pick. It's really two teams that have been efficient on both sides of the ball to end the season. Two teams that I really, really like and I really, really enjoy to watch. And it's going to be a classic series. And I had originally thinking Dallas in 6, but now that I'm looking back at it, I think this is going to be a little more competitive than a 6-game series. I'm going to take in 7 games. I'm going to take the Dallas Mavericks in 7 games. Here's why. OKC Thunder, they're young, they're inexperienced. I think Kyrie Irving could take advantage of the SGA matchup, and I think ultimately, for how good Chet Holmgren has been, I don't think he will make the biggest defensive impact in the world. I think that's the key for the Thunder and why they need to win the series, but I don't think Chet will be this monster on the defensive side of the ball. And I think Dallas's defense, the way they've been playing, if they can just limit Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, if they can limit him, as he is the primary piece around that OKC offense, and he sets up everybody, it will cause the others to miss shots. Trust me, when a young and inexperienced team starts getting cold, they really, really get cold. And I don't want to call this Thunder team young and inexperienced, but that is what they are. And it's really tough to trust a team, especially even though they did win their last series. It was against a team that wasn't playing with their best player, and they did what they were supposed to do and sweep them. And now they're playing a formidable opponent who's been really, really hot to finish the season. And I have to trust Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving more than I trust Shai and Jalen Williams. So I'm going to pick Dallas in 7. Dallas will go into OKC and win in a classic 7-game series there. But let's go on to our Eastern Conference series, and we'll start with the number 4 Cavaliers playing the number 1 Boston Celtics. They played 3 times this season, and the Boston Celtics won 2 of them. On December 2nd, Boston won 120-113 in Boston. In December 14th, the Celtics won 116-107 also in Boston. And on March 5th, the famous 20-something point comeback, and the Cavaliers won 105-104 in Cleveland. That was probably one of the games of the year for the entire league, the entire regular season, and that was its classic. But Cleveland has not really gotten blown out by Boston this year, so we'll see if they can hang in with Boston a little bit. In going into the series, we know that both big men are banged up. Porzingis is banged up with the injury near his Achilles. It's not his Achilles. He will be out for probably this whole series. Jared Allen has been banged up a little bit, and we don't know. He could be there for game 1. He's been listed as questionable a couple of games. He could be back for game 1, but it is a quick turnaround from game 7 to game 1. So you don't know if Jared Allen will be 100% ready to play, even though he sat out game 7. It's still 2 days is not really that much considering a recovery for the injury Jared Allen has. So we'll see if he's ready to go for game 1. If not, I probably expect him to be ready for game 3 at the latest. But Jared Allen will be back in this series. But for now, both big men are out. We all know in this series, though, that Boston's the team, man. Boston is the team to beat, and Cleveland's going to be in a tough situation, and it's going to be very hard for them to win basketball games in this series, considering how good Boston's defense is and considering how weak the Cavaliers' offense has been. And we've seen the Cavaliers' offense just completely fold at times this season. We've seen that a lot, and we've seen Boston's defense really attack teams and collapse their best players while also being a dominant force on the offensive side of the ball. And the question for Cleveland, if they want to hang in this series, can Donovan Mitchell get help? That's the only way. I'm sorry. Cleveland, if Donovan Mitchell Plays great. That's okay. You'll still get swept. You're going to have to get help. And that is ultimately the key for teams to beat Boston. It can't just be one player. When the Heat beat the Celtics the last couple of years, was it just Jimmy Butler or was it guys like Caleb Martin, guys like Gabe Vincent stepping up? Cleveland's going to have that same situation. It's going to be guys like Max Strus and Karis LeVert who stepped up in Game 7 to step up ultimately in this series. And it can't just be one game like in Game 7 against Orlando. It has to be every single game. And you still may lose some of those games, but it will put you in a better position to win games. And if Boston collapses in some of those games where you're playing very, very well, you will have the shot to steal some of those games. And when you steal one, now the pressure's on Boston. You steal another one. Here we go. Now this is a series. So if Cleveland can get help from Donovan Mitchell, get help other than Donovan Mitchell, that is the only way I see them winning this series. Garland will do his thing, 15 points, but you're going to need guys like Mobley, Strus, LeVert, Dylan Windler, Marcus Morris Sr., Tristan Thompson. You're going to need guys to step up. And I don't know who, but it's going to have to be consistent if they want to win this series. Now, for the Boston Celtics, the only concern I really have going into this series is that they are not very good at shooting near the paint. They're not good scoring in the paint, and considering teams are going to want to run them off the three-point line, and Cleveland has that big man, Evan Mobley, on the interior, because we know that every team's going to force Boston inside. And Boston's going to have to convert those inside shots. And Evan Mobley is, as I mentioned, great presence on the defensive side of the ball here. Great presence at the rim. And he could cause Boston some problems in the series. And it could cause Boston to get a little bit stagnant on the offensive side of the ball at times. And also, Boston, even if they do attack the rim and they get fouled, their free throw shooting, especially in that last series against Miami, has not been that great. And if ultimately that's free points, and if you let free points go, it can let teams back into games. It's free points on the board. If you're up 10, you miss some free throws, now it's still 10. It's basically like a stop. It's basically like the team getting to stop and the clock stop for Cleveland as well while you're giving up these free points, giving opportunities for them to come back into games. And Boston really didn't shoot the free throws that well. I think they shot like 70%, which that's going to cost you in some games. So they got to be a little bit careful because even though Cleveland's not the formidable opponent, not that great, Miami was just absolutely injured, and no matter what happened, they were going to win that series. But Cleveland could potentially take advantage of some of that stuff, considering how good their defense is, and if, of course, their role players are hot at times. I could also see the Holiday matchup causing Donovan Mitchell some problems, and that may be a huge concern for Cleveland, because if Donovan Mitchell is not playing well, you might as well just call this a sweep, close the book, close the series. So if Jrue Holiday causes Donovan Mitchell problems, there's no conversation to be had about this series, and this should be a quick, easy series. And going back to Cleveland a little bit, can you stop Tatum, Brown, and White, especially the Tatums and the Browns? Because those guys are ultimately going to be why you lose the series, because that's ultimately every series for them. Who will the star players step up for Boston, which we've seen every single series, and we expect them to do so. But if you cause problems for all of them on the defensive side of the ball, considering Porzingis is now out, now you just have to stop those guys. And if Porzingis was in this series, it would be much worse for Cleveland because of the defensive rotations that Mobley will have to do from the interior to the perimeter. Now they have a potential opportunity, if they play solid defense, cause those guys some problems, and maybe get in the series a little bit. But ultimately, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Derek White's emergence of what we saw, especially in that first round against Miami, all all-star caliber players, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I just don't really see any way that Cleveland can win the series, because ultimately Cleveland has one guy we know can take over games. It's Donovan Mitchell, right? Boston has 4 to 5 of them in the series, probably 4, and Jrue Holiday, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Derek White. But they have 4 guys. Cleveland has 1. Math doesn't really add up there. Boston in 5, maybe a sweep, but I'll give Cleveland a game here. I'll take Boston in 5. And our last series that we are going to preview is the Indiana Pacers versus the New York Knicks. The Indiana Pacers and the Knicks played 3 times in the regular season, and Indy won 2 out of the 3 of the matchups. On December the 30th, the Pacers won 140 to 126 in Indiana. On February the 1st, the Knicks won 109 to 105 in New York. And on February the 10th, the Pacers won 125 to 111 in New York. This series has a history, especially in the 90s. We know those Pacers-Knicks series. We know the Reggie Miller choke sign. We know the Patrick Ewing dominance matchups. We know the fights, the brawls that have come out of the series. And this series is a rivalry. And trust me, I expect a lot of confrontations, a lot of fights, a lot of juiced up players. This series is going to be great. And it is a rivalry renewed for these two franchises. And of course, in the series, we know what the Pacers can do offensively. And a Knicks team that struggles to score at times can be scary for the New York Knicks. This series ultimately is going to probably be for New York at a quicker pace than, of course, the Philadelphia 76ers series. Indiana likes to fly. They like to score off transition. They like to score quickly early in the shot clock. And especially when New York, when you're considering you're only playing 7 guys now with the Bogdanovich injury. You've got your rotation of Brunson, Hart, DiVincenzo, OG Anunoby, Isaiah Hartenstein off the bench, Mitchell Robinson, Deuce McBride. That's it for New York. When you're playing 7 guys, when you're running at a fast pace, you're playing 48 minutes a game. That can cause some problems. That will definitely cause some problems for the Knicks. And I've said this before. Will the Knicks run out of juice a little bit? Will the Knicks run out of ultimate steam and run out of ultimate injury, considering Thibodeau was running these guys to the ground? And it sucks for New York because they've had the injury problems. It would probably be a 9-man rotation if they had Randall and if they had Bogdanovich, but ultimately they don't. So they're going to have to adjust. And they're going to have to find the stamina to keep up with the Pacers team. And that could be a concern going down the stretch of the series. And the more games this series goes for New York, the more scarier it will get for them and the more worn out they will be. And that could potentially cause some problems, especially when in this series, I think most of the games are every other day. So that will be a little bit tougher than some of the games being these 2-day rest periods. It will be a much quicker turnaround for the Knicks in this series. And I think for Indiana, in this series, they're going to have to find a way to stop Jalen Brunson, because in this series, I expect Jalen Brunson to go off. No offense to Tyrese Halliburton, Andrew Nembhard of the worlds on the defensive side of the ball. Jalen Brunson should go off in this series. There is no reason why Jalen Brunson shouldn't have an absolutely amazing series, and that's what I expect from Jalen Brunson. And if he doesn't, look out for the Pacers. Look out for Indiana. But I just don't see any way where Jalen Brunson gets stopped by what is a brutal and absolutely historically bad Indiana Pacers defense. Historically great Pacers offense, but just as bad, if not worse, defense for them. And a key for Indiana in the series is to limit shots in the paint. I think ultimately those Brunson 8 to 10-foot pull-ups are going to be what costs Indiana, because Indiana is the 4th worst team when giving up shots in the paint, and that could cause a lot of issues for them ultimately in the series. If Indiana can stop those shots in the paint, I think they will be in a position to win this series. Now, also for a key for Indiana is rebounding. New York is a great second chance team, and if ultimately the New York Knicks get those second chance opportunities, considering their offense is not the best, they don't have this great offense, it will be much easier for them to score, and you're giving them opportunities to hang in with your offense, especially if you're going to rely on your offense to win you this series. It's going to be tough, especially if they get a lot of offensive rebounds. And also for New York, what's interesting in the series is going to be the matchup between the two former Toronto Raptors, OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam. We know Pascal Siakam has asserted himself as the best player ultimately in this playoff run for Indiana so far. Of course, Indiana's young and inexperienced in the playoffs, and the former champion Siakam has really asserted himself, taking over the offense a little bit. And if OG Anunoby can cause him some problems, I think that you're going to have to rely on the inexperienced Indiana guys. And sometimes when you rely on inexperienced guys in the postseason, it doesn't work out that well. Of course, Indiana won their series against Milwaukee, and they should have. Giannis was out. Dame was out. They did their business. They did what they were supposed to do. But if New York gives some problems to Siakam with that Anunoby matchup, can someone make a statement for Indiana? Could it be Halliburton? Could it be Nesmith? Could it be a guy off the bench like TJ McConnell, Ben Shepherd? Somebody's got to help out Siakam for Indiana when things get a little bit stagnant. Because trust me, this is a much better defensive team than the Milwaukee Bucks. This New York's defense is going to be on Siakam. They're going to be on Halliburton. So who else? Who else is going to step up for them? Now, in this series, for my pick personally, the Pacers have been absolutely amazing this season, and you got to give them a lot of credit for what they've done, even though they beat a team in Milwaukee that was absolutely brutal all season. You got to give them credit. They made the second round. They could potentially go to the conference finals, and they're doing something that we didn't expect them to do this season. But I think New York's defense will cause Indiana's offense some problems, and if it gets to this defensive kind of a series where it's a lower scoring kind of a series, I'm picking New York. And I think New York's the better team. They have better players playing on the court. And I'm going to take the New York Knicks in 6 games in this series. Now, I was going to talk about a little bit about the Lakers firing Darvin Ham for just a little bit of a second. Ultimately, this firing was expected from many people around the NBA world. This firing was supposed to happen. But do I agree with the firing? No, not really. I think coaches should get at least 3 years, especially considering that coach made it to the Western Conference Finals. But ultimately, it's not really Rob Pelinka's team. It's LeBron's team. It's Lee GM's team. He didn't like Darvin Ham. And do I agree with the firing? No. Is it going to ultimately happen? Yes. Is the Lakers' job probably the toughest NBA head coaching job to possibly have? Yes. So you're under a lot of pressure when you're the Lakers head coach, and I expect Darvin Ham to be a head coach in this league. But it's a tough situation to come in with the Lakers as a first-year head coach. So if you're the Lakers looking for another head coach, you're going to have to explore the possibilities of a Mike Budenholzer, someone who's experienced, someone with championship pedigree. I think they've mentioned JJ Redick being in those conversations, but again, even though he's close with LeBron, they have their own podcast now. That's a LeBron move, and that would be LeBron coaching the team. And JJ Redick, I think they need somebody to assert themselves, bring in their offense, bring in their defensive schemes, and that guy is Mike Budenholzer to me. I think Mike Budenholzer would be the perfect hiring for this Lakers team, and I think there's no other options. I would be excited if JJ Redick was the head coach for the Lakers, and I think that would be an intriguing thing to watch, an intriguing thing to view. But I think for the Lakers' sake, I think just hiring Mike Budenholzer, giving him a lucrative contract will be the best option for the Los Angeles Lakers. And that's all I got to say about that. There's not really anything else to say about that. We discussed them on the Lights Out segment. So I think that'll do it for today's show. Thank you so much for watching the podcast. And remember, please follow me on Instagram at take_your_shot_podcast_ and tell me how you would have taken your shots on these takes. That's all my shots for the day. See you Wednesday after we get some of those conference semifinals going. It'll be exciting to recap those. Preview the draft lottery that's going to be happening later this week. Exciting stuff going on in the NBA. Thank you so much. Remember, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you on Wednesday.